Welcome to this new episode of the First Amendment. My name is Yasser Al-Ghaslan, and in this episode we will be joining Mr. Michael Jones, who is one of the co-founders of the Tea Party movement, to talk about the GOP, specifically the current situation, the future of the party, and as well the relation with the Democratic Party and Biden, and in general the impact of Trumpism in the past 4 years and in the future 4 years. This program is usually done in Arabic for the Arab community, for the Arab-speaking audience, but in this specific episode we thought to do it in English because of the importance of the guest and what he can present. Before starting the episode, I'll have a quick introduction in Arabic, and then we'll start right away with the interview. سلام، أنا ياسر الغسلان، وهذه حلقة جديدة من التعديل الأول. اليوم ضيفي هو السيد مايكل جونز، وهو أحد المؤسسين لحزب الشاي، وهي الحركة المعروفة داخل الحزب الجمهوري اللي تأسست عام 2009. تحدثت معه في وقت سابق حول الحراك المختلف المتوقع داخل الحزب، عن الترامبية، عن سبب خسارة الرئيس ترامب للانتخابات، وكذلك الدور اللي قام فيه خلال السنوات الأربعة داخل الحزب الجمهوري، وما هو المتوقع من الحزب الجمهوري في المرحلة اللاحقة، وكذلك مستقبل ترامب السياسي والترامبية السياسية في المرحلة اللاحقة. أتمنى يكون هذا اللقاء، وهو طبعا باللغة الإنجليزية، يحوز على رضاكم، ونبدأ باللقاء. Mr. Michael Jones, thank you very much for joining us in the First Amendment and this discussion on the GOP and what we can expect in these 4 years to come. So thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Michael, first of all, if you can give us like a brief description on what are the main and the most important Tea Party. We hear a lot in the Middle East about the Tea Party, but what is it exactly, and how does it differ from the Republican Party in general terms?
Well, the Tea Party movement, founded in 2009, was founded on really just some very simple principles: adherence to our Constitution, limited government, lower taxes. That made us natural allies with the Republican Party, but in technical terms, we're not a political party, even though there have been some pressures to move in that direction. It's the largest and most politically consequential grassroots political movement in the country's history. We, accomplishment-wise, in the 8 years of Obama administration, really immediately took the House of Representatives back in 2010 that blocked Obama's legislative agenda, succeeded in 2014 in taking back and really laying the groundwork for Trump's populist, grassroots, rally-based 2016 presidential race. And, throughout there, we've been engaged in a broad number of federal, state, and local policy issues and races. We won 1,000 total political elections during the Obama administration. I was a day one supporter of President Trump on June 16, 2015, when he announced his nomination, or announced his running. Others weren't, but many of the individuals that Trump ran against also have Tea Party allegiances and origins in their political involvement. So that was one of the reasons. But I would say for the last 4 years, we've been by and large very supportive of the president. Whatever happens in the ongoing election dispute, which is a complicated but immensely important issue we're confronting now, this movement will continue to be a vibrant, influential force in American politics, in my view, for a long time to come. Mm-hmm. And in both the political dynamic and the policy dynamic, and in the education and communication of the American people of these hugely important values and issues that we confront.
There is a lot of talk I can see and hear read about the actual presence of the Tea Party today. I mean, some writers and people say that the Tea Party as as a body or as a group doesn't exist on the ground. And that's why, and from what I understand, you're saying that no, it actually exists. So maybe the direct question is the Tea Party, the way it was founded in the 2009, 10, and 11, is it still active? And who are like the main representatives, let's say, individuals in Congress that still believe in the Tea Party movement main ideas?
Well, so if you look back at 2009, I mean, we had almost no political representation in Congress or in the administration. So we had, Nancy Pelosi running the House, Harry Reid running the Senate, Obama elected, media more or less in the hands of the far left, academia in the hands of the left. And a lot of Americans looked around and didn't feel that they identified institutions politically or otherwise that really represented the core principles of founding the country. It's one of the reasons we chose the iconic Tea Party from Massachusetts, kind of the preemption to the launch of the Revolutionary War as a name and a brand identity. Then, of course, as you start winning elections, challenges shift. So you become maybe less engaged in the very high visible rallies and public political events and more engaged in actual governing. So in 2010, when we took the House back, we founded the Tea Party Caucus, now the Freedom Caucus. It's the primary force of conservative thinking within the House of Representatives. In 2014, when you look at some of the Senate figures that were elected in that election and earlier, I mean, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, all ran as Tea Party first and foremost candidates. I mean, they were all Republicans because it was the party they identified with, but the core support that they received in each one of those states and in their agenda was very much aligned with us. And unbeknownst to many, Donald Trump himself spoke in Boca Raton in 2011 to a large Tea Party rally and was impressed with it. And I think in the eyes of many, in fact, there was a few articles written about it at the time about the effect that it had in his understanding of populism and of rally-based campaigning, because we look at the last 4 years and say, well, this is the way it always was. No, it's not the way it always was. It's very unusual and difficult to get 18 to 20,000 people take time out of their day and show up for a few hours to hear a presidential candidate. As you saw, Joe Biden couldn't even get 100 people in a high school gymnasium. But I think he was influenced immensely by that, and in a largely successful way. And I'm not trying to take any credit away from him, because not everybody could do that. He had the personal traits, the messaging that really was along with the foundation that I think we set in place, that was successful in being able to inspire 63 million Americans ultimately to get out and vote for him.
And today, just to mention some names, who do you think are the main names in Congress that represents or are still loyal to the Tea Party movement ideas?
Well, even in the administration, I would start by saying, some of the more central figures got their start in the team. Mark Meadows was a Tea Party Republican and chief of staff to the president. Mike Pompeo, Tea Party Republican Secretary of State. Many others populated throughout the administration in key roles in the Senate. Pence, absolutely. The four that I mentioned in the Senate, I definitely would identify with. And I think you could look at any member of that Freedom Caucus. Jim Jordan's the guy I think really highly of. What an extraordinary congressman he's been, and what a great leader and communicator too, for our message. Is all our Tea Party. There ultimately were over about 60 House members that came in 2010, and you probably could identify about half a dozen or more in the Senate that are very closely aligned with us.
Actually, as the numbers, I saw some numbers regarding it's in 2019. They were saying that there's about 12 senators, I think, and 19 representatives that are, clearly identified as Tea Party. And I mean, from what I understand, that in a sense you're saying that Trump might be maybe not a part of the movement, but he actually believes in a lot of what. And this is a discussion I actually had with some friends. And some of them say, yeah, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. So what's your take on that? Do you see Trump as being like a real representation of the Tea Party movement?
I absolutely do. I feel, firstly, he's said nothing but positive things about the movement publicly, to the extent he's been asked about it. I know he's been supportive of it. And like I said, he even spoke at some of our rallies. I wish we had involved him even more than we did in retrospect. I think he was a great voice for it. And the other thing is, it's not just that the Tea Party movement has contributed to Trump, but Trump's contributed to the movement by, I think, properly, as I saw right away, but others didn't, seeing how these trade and immigration issues were central themes that were very much hurting the middle class of the country and were hugely important components of us being able to address what was on the minds of the American people. And that really is ultimately what the Tea Party movement was about, because the same people that underestimated the Tea Party movement, who underestimated Trump and largely are people I have found who haven't spent a lot of time getting around this country. New York City or Washington, D.C. based. They typically don't leave those respective areas. And when you're there, you can kind of fall into a lot of collective groupthink about what's going on. But, if you'd been like I had been throughout this country over the last decade, in small towns throughout the upper Midwest and elsewhere, the Midwest, the Northeast, you started to see recurring themes of the real price being paid in this ongoing multi-decade demise of manufacturing and the lack of attention and support that was being paid to this as people's whole lives were being destroyed. You started to see how many people, and particularly middle-aged men, were falling into opioid addiction. You started to see the cost that was being paid in crime and in other ways with illegal immigration. There was no way you could ignore those issues if you were getting through and traveling around this country. But if you were sitting, on K Street or sitting on Avenue of the Americas, and that was your perspective of the world, you could very easily miss those things. And I think a lot of those who underestimated these two forces have done that.
And what did change? Because, in the past, we used to always, identify the working class with the Democrats.
Right.
And even historic. And that's one of the questions that, I received on social media regarding this interview, is that in the past, the Republican Party was very much in the support of the minorities and, the slavery and supporting, even minorities. And there is kind of a shift that happened with time. And we see now that the more, working class is more attached towards the Republicans. And also the minorities are more attached now towards the Democrats. So in simple words, what do you think was the reason to have this kind of complete change in approach?
Well, firstly, the story of civil rights in our country has been completely misreported by American media, particularly in modern times. But, the Republican Party was, really launched by Abraham Lincoln. We were the party that supported the end of slavery, actually. We were a leading force in civil rights legislation. That legislation would never have passed had it not been for the support it received through the party. And in fact, it's Democrats, even up until very recently, had been associated with some of the more extreme and racist elements of our country. Take a guy like Robert Byrd, who is revered by most Democrats. Hillary Clinton called him her mentor. Joe Biden gave a eulogy at his funeral in West Virginia. He was a leadership figure in the Ku Klux Klan in West Virginia. Now, media don't like to call attention to those facts. They like to exist because one of the stigmas they've attached to ideas with which they don't agree is to just flippantly call things racist, So, lowering marginal tax rates, that's racist. Securing a border, that's racist. Having better trade agreements with foreign countries, that's racist. It's an easy way to not dive into the minutia and specificity of what are ultimately important, complicated issues. But I'll tell you one thing I feel that is also true, that will be a Trump accomplishment, is that the support that he brought from and obtained from African Americans and from our Hispanic voters was greater than any Republican in history of this country. He did better in 2016 than either Romney or McCain did with those constituencies, and he did even better in 2020 than he did in 2016. Now, why is that? I mean, my judgment, firstly, ultimately, I'm not sure we call these communities. I mean, we're a country of individuals, and people hate being thrown into those because they have their own individual issues, their individual problems, and they're not identifiable by your ethnicity. There's a whole broad range of diversity within those ethnicities themselves from the standpoint of their challenges and their opportunities and their state of their lives. But, ultimately it turned out that securing the borders and creating jobs and increasing wages and restructuring trade agreements and cutting taxes and regulations were things that proved beneficial to all Americans. And when you looked at the issues that are confronting these communities, which have been governed by Democrats for decades, I mean, like literally Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, these are cities that have had no Republican leadership for decades, and they have regressed on the watch of that party. Educational systems have become increasingly flawed. The financial and fiscal status of the cities have become increasingly flawed. Drug problems, gun violence problems, all have worsened. Welfare dependency has worsened.
But don't you think that might be one of the, I mean, the other opinion would say, because maybe these minorities or these cities you've mentioned have a lot of poverty, because the lack of maybe opportunities for the minorities, because it's systematic. I mean, the other side would say that is one of the reasons why you would see this kind of chaos in these cities, rather than having it in a much more states that are much more richer, let's say like Texas, for instance, or other world.
I think we've come to the conclusion that's the surface argument that's presented, but ultimately the policies that are enacted by these respective cities and communities and states really matter, and they're difference makers. You could look at in the global arena, say South Korea and Africa as two examples. One of which embraced entrepreneurship, free market economies, and blossomed to be an economic powerhouse. Another of which kind of fell back on foreign aid reliance and never really became a democratic never embraced democracies, and struggled. In this country, I mean, you've got, even between states, an extraordinary migration of individuals out of liberal Democrat states where they're being taxed highly, where they're being overregulated, where the cities and states are being poorly managed into Republican and more conservative states. It's like New York, New Jersey, both, very Democrat states have had a mass migration into more conservative states like Florida over the last few years. It's been undeniable. If you go to Texas now, and particularly a few areas of Texas, you find just an extraordinary number of Californians just say, look, it's the system's broken. I mean, their priorities aren't even in line. They're all about, illegal immigrants, and, the tax rates are high. There's no job creation. The educational systems are broken. So Democrats are failing. The constituencies that they have long said that they represented have not fared well on their watch. They have begun to lose the traditional grip that they had on these constituencies. And I think over the last 4 years, especially, it was starting to become pretty transparently obvious. And what's one of the reasons that the opposition to Trump has been so immense is that this paradigm of a lie that somehow the policies that have failed these communities for like as long as 50 years now are somehow just need another 2 more years or 4 more years until they succeed has become an astonishingly preposterous position to hold. They've been tried, they've failed. It's time for new approaches. And even within our Tea Party movement, I mean, we've had an extraordinary rise of African-American leadership. We were very influential in electing the first African-American Republican senator in U.S. history, in Tim Scott. I think have a broad recognition that we want to be a constructive force in these cities and in offering an alternative. I just don't, having lived in cities, including some of the ones I mentioned, I've seen firsthand the disgust and the ambivalence that they have about their cities. It gets to a point where you sort of take it for granted. These things are just never going to improve. And that's a very desperate and bad situation to be in anywhere in the world, but particularly in a country that does offer the magnitude of opportunity that I think our country still does potentially present.
Great. If we can move now a little bit to talk about Trump and the party and the future of the party. But prior to that, can you tell us from your point of view, what are the things that maybe Trump was successful in and what are the failures? I mean, I'm sure there is a lot of good things he did. And of course, as a Republican, I'm sure you would see that as being, the majority of things are positive. But if we can say like 2 things that he did well that served the country and 2 things that he wasn't very much successful with, what would they be?
Well, you start with the tax cuts that he put in place right away and say, he created 7.3 million jobs before the pandemic hit and had wages rising for the first time since the turn of the century. That also led to the lowest unemployment in 50 years for the country, lowest African-American, Hispanic, and Asian unemployment in all history of the country. So we were overtaxing our citizens, and you can't underestimate either the cut in the corporate rate. We were taxing companies 35%. He brought that down to 27, I believe. No, 21, but from 35 to 21. Biden wants to increase it to 27. So that was a dramatic opportunity for companies to expand their operations in the U.S., for some companies to relocate back into the U.S., for companies to invest in growth and hiring. And so it was universally positive. And it's common sense. It's sort of out of, even Keynesian economic 101 books teach that, cutting taxes leads to growth. It's amazing to me that there's not a more universal recognition to that fact.
So taxes is one. That's one of the things that he did positively. What would be a second thing?
Well, I think on the one issue in the foreign policy area, there's many issues in the foreign policy area, but ISIS was really a point of becoming not just a regional threat where it had taken over a significant part of Iraq and Syria, but had become, a global threat, including to the United States, and clearly an enemy. He ran on a promise of eliminating ISIS, and to be able to go in and have the magnitude of almost 100% decimation of that was immensely positive. And he's not received the level of domestic appreciation, I think, for the magnitude of that, which I'm just thinking globally now, but then I also think about pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Okay. If you're focused on the environment, as many people around the world are, and as I think, Trump is, as I am, you start with the largest polluter in the world, which is China. And to put in place an agreement that literally requires China to do nothing in the way of reducing its CO2 emissions, while operating on an assumption that we're going to send all of this money predominantly into developing nations, and that is somehow going to resolve a very complicated and still in dispute scientific question about what exactly is going on in our environment.
It's not fair.
It was a completely flawed agreement. His getting out of it was popular, and we can do things in support of the environment, both globally and at home, without being in that. I would also say that, look, Iran is a major global threat. It ranks with China, in my view, as the greatest geostrategic threat in the region. And the Iran agreement itself was one of the singular worst policy steps, in my judgment, ever made by any president in modern times. We, rewarded them financially at a time when they should have been isolated financially. Every piece of evidence suggests they continued their nuclear weapons development program. They expanded their regional terrorism in ways that proved extraordinarily harmful and threatening to the region. And putting this maximum pressure on Iran has held back their nuclear weapons development program. They're still engaged in terrorism, but we've at least deprived them of some of the resources they can allocate toward that. And we've taken out in Soleimani one of the worst forces in the world, in my view, and labeled the IRGC, a terrorist entity, which is fairly unprecedented to take a component of a government and label it a terrorist entity. But when you have that entity of Iran's military that is engaged specifically in terrorist activities, literally on the ground in foreign countries doing that, it was appropriate to do that. That was a big accomplishment.
Yeah, Michael, I would like just to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but in regards of the Iran issue, I mean, I'll tell you how I see it. And I know that some of my comrades in the Middle East wouldn't necessarily agree with me, but I mean, the counter narrative of what you're saying about Iran is today, yes, Trump left the nuclear deal and the maximum pressure. But if we see things on the ground today, we see that Iran is much more aggressive in the region. For instance, in Yemen, prior to Trump, there was this war with Saudi Arabia, but the Houthis had very limited impact on the Saudi internal on the ground. So they used to send maybe a drone or so. In these 4 years, they've reached, with the Iranian support, to very dangerous levels in hitting Saudi Arabia. That's one. If you look at, for instance, in Syria, we know that now Syria is completely lost in terms of toppling Bashar al-Assad, changing the regime. It's back to normal, and that's also part of it is for the Iranian influence. Lebanon, it's clear. Iraq is clear. So when we compare, I'm not sure that the kind of policy that Trump took in terms of excluding Iran or facing Iran the way he did actually made them weaker. I see it in a sense that maybe made them much more willing to be aggressive.
But quantifiably, I can tell you our intelligence shows that they have less financial resources dedicated to terrorism now than they did following that agreement. And that's the metric. And as I said, I agree with you. The Yemen situation is really troubling. And I would also say, here's another point, most relevant, maybe to many of your viewerships. I would say I think our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is an immensely important bilateral relationship, has improved. I mean, Obama, was motivated by this kind of blind allegiance to Iran and some degree of hostility really toward the Saudis. And it's tough in the United States to, I've valued the relationship with Saudi Arabia. I believe it's a relationship of promise. And I know that, there continue to be human rights and other concerns, but some of them significant. But I see Saudi Arabia is really crucially important to the region. And for the most part in the last 4 years, while you've had these prominent exceptions to what I'm about to say, the Washington Post reporter, all those things, I know all about it. Saudi Arabia has done a lot of things been very constructively focused in the region that have been, in my judgment, more designed toward regional peace and prosperity. And I think that's been a product of our expanded relationship and the promise that, of Saudi Arabia being a major country in that region offers for it. I mean, we talk a lot about Yemen, but absent the philanthropic and humanitarian support that the Saudis have put into Yemen has been really important. The role that Saudi Arabia has played, I think, in its influence in the region, including with these new agreements with UAE and others with Israel, can't be underestimated. And I saw with interest that they want to be part of the Iran agreement. If we do by chance go back into the Iran agreement, I think Saudi Arabia's inclusion in that as a positive would be a good thing, because ultimately one of the main reasons, there's like 1,000 reasons we don't want to have Iran have nuclear weapons.
Of course, yeah.
But one of those reasons is we also don't want to see a regional arms race. And it would be very difficult if Iran did develop a nuclear weapons capability, which it's by most judgments very close to doing, if it doesn't already have it. It would be very, very difficult to say, no, but Saudi Arabia can't defend itself. It can't have so that's important. But just to continue, I didn't mean to divert into those issues.
No, I just ones. Go back to maybe the second part of my previous question about, you've mentioned the positives of Trump.
Yeah.
And also in very simple terms, what do you think about the two main mistakes he did?
If I were going to name two, it starts with personnel, meaning, a business the size that he ran relies on personnel. But when you get into a federal government, your government requires individuals at all levels who are going to actually execute and make sure that the policy vision that the president has are actually implemented, that they actually become reality. And to see the magnitude of people that were brought into this administration who subsequently left and criticized the president, wrote books negatively about the president, probably leaked to media negatively about the president, and really found reasons to procrastinate and not execute on his vision those first 2 years when we had control of the House and Senate. It's tough to say that wasn't a lost opportunity. The wall should have been completely funded and constructed, built, and completed in those first 2 years. It wasn't, because there were, people providing, it was partly the House leadership and partly the chief of staff there and other individuals didn't execute on that. That is a clear deficiency.
So one is personality. He had issues in his personality in dealing with the whole new circumstances.
Yeah.
Second?
Well, The second is going to be a very present tense issue, because if the magnitude of election fraud happened as we're seeing slowly released in these legal filings and in affidavits, it's wrong and it's not fair for us to just simply look at this and blame those who did those things illegally and destructively to our system, but to not ask where were we? So, for instance, we have this Dominion election system, right? That still major allegations about it made by the council to the campaign that it was manipulated. Not yet proven, but we've got affidavits now emerging and things that seem to be suggestive. And it has a whole history of problems. Like, so if you go back and you look at Smartmatic, its component parts were close to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and it was part of manipulation of elections in Venezuela, in Argentina, in the Philippines. It was looked at 3 times by the state of Texas and rejected as being completely susceptible to cyber hacking and manipulation. I would have to say, you can't just say this election was rigged. You have to say, where was our side as this system and as all these other practices were put into place that proved so destructive to this 2020 election?
Maybe that I'm just being a devil advocate. I'm sure that the Republicans were there. I mean, I don't think they were sleeping. The question is, if they were there and they didn't do anything about it, was there actually anything there? I mean, the other side would say this. I mean, that's a proof that there was.
I'm not hearing anyone arise saying, "Oh no, this Dominion and Smartmatic systems were impeccable, and here's why, of all the whatever hundreds of options that were available to us, this is why this system and this system alone was the best one." I'm seeing those people hiding from the scrutiny, just like Dominion itself is hiding from scrutiny. But I would say those people who were in, because I realize there were many Democrat constituencies, but I don't think they were exclusively. I would like to, and even if they were, we still had a responsibility and oversight where we should have been saying, no, these are vulnerable systems. Don't put them into place. Now, obviously, if you'd gone back before, I would not have listed that before this election. We all anticipated some degree of fraud based on the magnitude of mail-in ballots. I'm not listing anything in the pandemic management because I realized that was a point that was drilled home by Biden. But honestly, I think this president acted pretty boldly and seriously in the handling of it. The other major issue that arose in his 4 years that was negative, because most of the things are positive, his first 3 years. If you go back to, say, November of 2019, this country was humming on all cylinders. There weren't too many negative things happening. And he was executing on promises. So I don't list the pandemic in there because, he put in place the travel ban on January 30, which with Biden opposed. He moved extraordinary amounts of health resources and assets nationally to address this. It's clear to me that the vaccine progress and the therapeutic progress was strong. And this vague criticism that somehow he didn't follow the science is perplexing to me, because the science itself was not in any way unified. So let's just take the issue of masks. If you were following the science on masks in, say, March or April, you would have looked to the World Health Organization, you would have looked to the CDC. Both were saying, do not use masks. We need them for healthcare providers, right? And Trump never came out. He never said, don't use masks. Whatever you think, positive, negative, or neutral on that issue, he always said, listen to your local healthcare providers and follow their guidance. It seems to me now the mask sort of became kind of a political prop that was utilized in a way to sort of suggest somehow that Trump had failed on this issue.
It became something like we and them. And so they're like identifying, between the parties.
Yeah, so I see, Biden in his basement in Delaware, he'll have it on, and then he's ripping it off at the end of a an interview or, these, clearly it's been utilized as a prop. And it's not even like there is one mask, as you likely know. There are some masks that are enormously effective. Those aren't the ones that are being utilized in our country for the most part, and there's others. I think he was the first president to really confront the reality of China, but, look, I mean, did he resolve those issues? No.
Very complicated.
They worsened on Obama's watch, but he at least kept them at bay. On the other issue would be, like, could the infrastructure was a promise that was made, and Democrats just didn't want to give him a victory on that. It's tough for me to come around and to sort of say, well, you didn't get infrastructure done, knowing that you need to run that through Congress, that it was going to be probably a $1 to $2 trillion investment in our infrastructure. I appreciate the fact that he raised it as a national priority. I think our infrastructure in this country is lacking. It's in need of the kind of magnitude of engagement that he promised. But once resist became the motto of Democrats, it was very difficult to get that done. And then losing the House in 2018, I think you got to sort of look at some of these political losses and say, yeah, they probably had some. I think the bottom line of my view, if you were going to say, what is your criticism, is firstly, for any Trump supporter at this point, there's a lot of blind loyalists, and I've been universally positive for 4 years. Now the election's over, and you have to be introspective. I think a lot of it came down to the fact that we all knew, who, having worked in the White House, having worked in DC for over a decade in all capacities, everyone knows that the people in these jobs are hugely important decisions. Mm-hmm. And he had the whole world amassed against him in a way. You had media against him, academia against him.
Comes with the territory. Yeah.
Democrats against him. I mean, not a little bit, but completely. Like, anything he wanted to do was a bad idea. The one area he could have controlled were these staffing decisions in these departments and agencies. And I think he offloaded a lot of that, and it ended up with some really bad decision making. You could argue that his entire impeachment was a product of not clearing out the National Security Council and putting in people who were aligned with his agenda. Because when you're ultimately listening on all that Ukraine testimony, the other thing is, here's another one for you, the DOJ. I'm not comfortable. I don't think any American is, that we have depoliticized our Department of Justice. I mean, there's not been accountability on Obamagate. And to hear our Attorney General yesterday say that there's no signs of systemic fraud, when I know for a fact that not one of these whistleblowers has been interviewed, and they have really not, while they're starting to do a few things, that is an absolute premature and counterproductive statement to make. I don't know what political or other considerations went into it, but the reality is we got nothing but evidence amassed.
But that, Michael, if I may interrupt, I mean, this is Bill Barr, he and Pompeo are the two loyalists of Trump. So coming out with this kind of statement, it couldn't be because he's against him. I mean, I can't understand why would his statement not be accurate, because he doesn't need to, he's not trying to defeat Trump or to make something that might affect him negatively. Maybe he's just making or doing his job the correct way.
Well, but it's a premature statement. It would be like the Massachusetts State Police coming out in 2011 and saying, Aaron Hernandez is not a murderer. He's the greatest tight end in New England Patriots history. And then, oh, by the way, we discovered, he was involved in all these murders. I mean, you have probable cause to initiate an investigation. The president authorized DOJ to initiate that. Clearly, the Trump legal team has very limited confidence in the seriousness that they're bringing to it, which is why they're doing most of the work. To issue a statement like that before you have even begun the interview process of what are now hundreds of first-person witnesses, and by the way, most of these are not political people.
Was he pressured, you think?
Don't know. I just think that obviously you can't tell me that you're immune from those degrees of pressure. So, you've got, a guy who's trying to prepare a transition in Joe Biden and a Biden transition team. And they say, look, it would be helpful if you came out with a statement like that. Is he phone up or is he responsive? I don't know the particulars of it, but I thought he was doing an interview with the Associated Press. I thought it would be a good time not to be commenting in any way about any of these things. Just do the work that we are asking of you to investigate these issues. And then, quite honestly, I felt the same way about the Trump legal team. I didn't think it was a good move to come out and make all these allegations before you made the federal filing, put together the lawsuits, issue the filings, and then make the comments. Now, they may have been concerned about the calendar and the fact that states are starting to certify and the electors are going to be selected and whatnot. But I just think, if you are out there right now in your state deciding whether or not to certify these elections that have credible allegations of fraud, and you're engaged in electoral selection and you're having to make a determination about the seriousness of this, or even if you're a federal judge or a district judge out there who's going to hear one of these matters, you're trying to tell me you're not influenced by the fact that the Attorney General, the highest law enforcement official in the country, has dismissed them, doesn't become a consideration. It seems to
prior to
balance of justice.
Sorry for the interruption. Prior to that, there is, I think, over 38 cases that were, that the Trump team lost. I mean, I recall maybe only one or two maybe cases out of all of the cases that Giuliani and his team, had in the courts. So the numbers are not very optimistic for the team of Trump, and even Trump, I think.
There's appellate options on all of those, though. But I mean, realize a lot of these judges are party appointees. Unfortunately, you've got
some of them are Republicans.
That's also true, and but also, as we pointed out, in the Trump era, not terribly meaningful, because this has been a president who's not a party apparatchik. Some of his most vocal enemies have been within the party because there's people who don't want to reform the party. And I'm not, and some of these cases, I've read the rulings on them. Like just take the issue of Pennsylvania and the expansion by 72-hour time period for amending your filing. Clearly an illegal process. I mean,
if I may interrupt again, sorry, I'll go into the internal dynamics of the party between Trump and the Republicans after two questions. But I would like to ask you this question because I think it's important for the shift from the two parts of the interview. In clear words, I would like to hear your comments on, first of all, do you think Trump lost? And if you believe that Trump lost, why do you think he lost?
My position on this has been, I don't know. The allegations of fraud are significant enough that it's possible he didn't. I think it's a real uphill struggle to be able to accomplish that. But let's assume there's no fraud, that the election results are exactly as reported. If you were going to say what were the factors in his losing, I would cite a few things. Number one, obviously the pandemic. It's very easy to run as an opponent when you are running against a status quo environment that was negative, meaning the first 3 years of accomplishment, I think, were quickly lost in the minds of most Americans. People live in the present tense, what's going on right now. Many millions of Americans lost their job. Their ways of life were altered. True in many countries, not just our own, but I'm sure it's had profound political effects globally, see it in similar ways. But it was clearly a very detrimental development. And it also removed his ability to go out and do these rally-based campaign tactics that he had utilized so successfully in 2016. It seems to me you really can't credibly say, it could be a credible fact that you say, I've managed this as competently as I can, and we lost 250,000 lives. But in a political context, you can't say that. Right? It's too many people that were lost.
Right.
And you have to accept politically, you have to accept responsibility for it all. So that was a big factor.
And, so because maybe I understand. Maybe you're saying that he was on this issue on the defense. He could, yeah.
I mean, clearly, and there was some conflicting messaging early on about what should be done. I mean, ultimately, I think if you go back and realize we were trying to get our CDC into China in early January, and they said no. And I don't know what your feeling is about how China's managed this, but from my eyes, it was a complete, almost conscious effort on their part to make it as difficult as possible in the entire world. Oh. And you just look at the fact that they restricted the travel from Wuhan domestically while they allowed international flights to leave. Mm-hmm. And I'm astonished, even when I have appeared with CCP spokespersons, because they don't really have media, they just have their party spokespersons, that they're simultaneously trying to depict themselves as the world's experts on science and how to handle this. Well, they will not even acknowledge that this originated in China. If you don't understand that this originated in China, almost everything you have to say after that, in my view, has no credibility. Yeah. So clearly the pandemic was a big issue. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of debate over the street violence and how to respond. I don't think it net, I don't think it affected him politically. It was not uncomfortable to many Americans. I don't think they blamed him for it. There were some who feel he underacted, some feel he overacted. I don't think it was ultimately a big determination. So I would say, big part of the reasons were the pandemic shifted the debate, including his ability to communicate in the style that he traditionally had. And it prevented him from being able to discuss these 3 fairly great years of accomplishment, with trade agreements renegotiated, NATO starting to meet their 2% GDP obligations, the economy created over 7 million jobs, wages unprecedented, 1 point more jobs available than people had to fill them. He couldn't really talk about
that maybe one of the reasons, as a lot of people would say, that Trump came with an agenda that serves specifically his base, and all of what he did and his promises were basically for the base. And of course, that created a huge following among his base. I mean, we saw it in the how is it, 74 million that came out this year. But in the same time, it created this kind of reaction from the Democrats or the progressive or the left, call them or even the independent, that said, okay, if Trump is the president of the Republicans, then we need a president of our own. And that created, maybe an extra boost for them to move and go to the polls and vote. And that is maybe one of the reasons that, ultimately America is not only Republicans. I mean, the Republicans are a big part of it, yes, but there's a lot of people that don't, affiliate themselves with the Republican ideas, even if they are great economically and stuff like that. And the personality point you've mentioned about Trump being very aggressive and, a person that maybe not a lot of people would like his style, made them, decide, okay, we're going to vote him out just because we don't like him.
But here's the thing, in the numbers, if you have the 63 million who voted for him in 16, and then we don't know exactly what this number is, but 73, 74 million, you kind of logically conclude those 63 million voted for him in 16 came back out and voted in 20. So none of the base eroded. And you historically have seen that. We've seen that in many cases with presidents who lose some of their base support. So he added, about 10 million votes onto what he had in 16. The idea that
but lost with a bigger margin with Biden. I mean, when you look at the ratio, even if you have 80 million, if the other guy has 90 million, you're still lost. And the ratio is quite big. While when he won against Hillary, the ratio was smaller. I mean,
well, the popular vote is, you got to realize which I'm sure you do, but I mean, no one goes into these races trying to win the popular vote.
Right.
If Trump had spent more time in California, New York State, it's not, believe me, a lot of people in all of these, Illinois, New York, California, you would be investing in TV advertising in those states. You'd be appealing to those voters, and he would have done better in the popular vote in 16. And in 20, that's not the way the system's set up. So you gear it around the constitutional structure of the Electoral College, and that's the metric that you have to utilize. The states, if we don't have legal intervention or some other intervention by state assemblies to alter this, you still would say, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan were incredibly close races. I mean, it's really astonishing in a country of 330 million that we have now had so many elections in the 21st century that have been incredibly close and incredibly dependent on it, and on a relatively small number of states. In 2021, Florida, and here, arguably 5 or 6 that could go the other way.
Great. If I can move, there's this question that is now, I'm sure a lot of people ask, and this definition or this Trumpism. Do you believe that there is something called Trumpism today? And is Trumpism, the new Tea Party of the Republican Party? And if that's the case, who do you think are the main Trumpists, or the main loyalists of the Trumpanian? I don't know how do you say that in the Republican Party today.
Well, firstly, I think Trumpism is going to be an enduring reality. However this turns out, we've come to a few conclusions that trade and immigration belong at the centerpiece of our agenda, that populist appeal and going directly to the people is the way to go around this, what appears to be institutional media bias against conservative and right-of-center ideas, and that the idea of just turning the cheek when you're attacked by opponents, which made sense for a while. You kind of establish your statesmanship and your reasonableness and your diplomatic credentials, but it didn't work for McCain. It didn't work for Romney. And then it did. And then when Trump started hitting back, it did work. So we might be facing, I think, are facing the reality that we can't just be a punching bag for allegations that are untrue or for criticism. That controlling this debate and controlling the messaging is hugely important, and that means that you need to return fire, unfortunately, and some of this stuff. He's done that, his predecessors haven't, and it's been useful, I think, to him politically. Then as far as individuals go, I mean, I was day one. I think you look at Pompeo as somebody who represented the sentiments there. Intellectually, Peter Navarro in the White House, I think, has done a great job. He's been an extraordinary asset to this president, and could be a force and factor.
Lindsey Graham?
That wouldn't really consider it. I think he's come around to have a good personal relationship with the president and has done some constructive things, but you wouldn't look at his political career and say it's one that reflects, seriousness on the border or serious on the trade. He's also been a big force behind, obviously, as you know, the Iraq engagement and continued military presence in these regions of the world. And I think, I'm not sure I even answered your question on that earlier, but I do think that things have evolved where, 20 years after our involvement in Afghanistan, what are we going to be there 30 years? I mean, at some point, Afghanistan needs to figure out Afghanistan. Iraq needs to figure out Iraq. Syria needs to figure out Syria. Yeah. I know there's ominous forces. I know that there's involvement from foreign powers. I know there's evil at play. We did what we could to constructive forces. I think the Iraq involvement, in retrospect, was probably almost certainly a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how anyone now could look at that when you look at 3,000 American fatalities, all of the cost. Also, we could have a government that, is still chaotic and has been, Iranian has given Iran an opportunity to re-engage. It seems to me to have been, I think Trump's been right on this. There's a role for our forces. We need to be the strongest military power in the world. We are the strongest military power in the world. We need to make sure we maintain that status and the ability to fight and win any conflict at any moment. But this idea of staying power, of being occupying forces in these countries so far away and so complicated that have had long-standing ethnic and other conflicts seems to me to be detrimental, proven detrimental. I think that's going to be another part. I don't think you're going to see as much globalism in our party because of Trump and because of just the recognition we've all realized as we've reflected on those issues.
Great. I would like to end with some questions that I received from in social media, and if we can have the answers, quick answers, fast answers. One of them is basically, do you think that Trump actually mentioned this? He's going to maybe run if he doesn't win this election. He's going to run in 2024. Do you think he will run as part of the Republican Party, or maybe maybe an independent? And who do you think will run with him within the Republican Party if he runs in 24?
I don't know. As a short answer to that, I think his focus is on resolving these legal issues. I think that's where he should be, and maintaining the hope that he gets over 270 and stays in for another 4 years.
Another question is it true that the ultra-right is actually expanding by the day within the Republican base and within the Republican political environment?
How do you define the ultra-right?
The ultra-right, the extreme right, if we can put a face on it, maybe from a political point of view, I think maybe they refer more towards the Steve Bannon kind of people.
I think Steve Bannon has it right on a lot of issues. He's been right on China. He's been right on trade. I think I think we're starting to awaken to some of these issues. They're very China specific, and I think that there are growing influences. I support the work they're doing. I don't think there's particularly anything ultra right about him. He's a nationalist. He's an Americanist, and he's one of a large number of us who believe in this president and his agenda.
Another question is focusing on the youngsters and the new generation of Republicans.
Right.
Is the Republican Party focusing a lot on, nurturing these youngsters, specifically between the age of 18 to, let's say, 25, 26? Is there a focus on them?
Not enough, in my view. I think we've had an entire lost generation here of individuals who are naive and blind to the realities of big government, socialism, even communism, and we have to take that a whole lot more seriously and do a better job with it.
Do you think that Trump actually did a favor to the Republican Party on the long term, or was it more a negative impact on the party and on the country in general?
Donald Trump has saved the Republican Party from irrelevance, in my view, and I think it's arguably true that he saved this country, because I'm not sure we would have endured 4 years of Hillary Clinton on a whole bunch of fronts. His net contribution has been a universally positive and historic one.
My last question is, we all saw the way that the Democratic Party treated Trump in these past 4 years. It was a real, a fight and all, description. You can't describe it more than that. How do you think the Republican Party now, with the expected majority in the Senate, will deal with Biden? Will it be the same kind of dealing, partisan dealing, or do you think that the Republican would think, let's work together for the future of America?
Well, it's going to be really important to see if we can hold the Senate, because if we hold the Senate, a few things will not happen. One, we're not going to pack the courts, which, people don't always understand what that means. That means expand the courts. There's no limitation on our courts, the size. There's no qualification to be on the court. There's not even, believe it or not, as I've looked into it, I'm open to being corrected on this, even a citizenship requirement in being on the court. So that's not going to happen with a Republican Senate. The filibuster rule, which requires 60 votes for passage, would stay in place. That's going to mean that Biden's going to need, as you point out, cooperation from Republicans to get some things done. That should be a buffer against some of the more extreme ideas that the radical left has in mind. And you also likely will not see DC or Puerto Rico granted statehood, which in the eyes of many Democrats will give them 2 additional senators from each and would almost permanently transform the Senate. So, these 2 Georgia races in January 5 are really important.
Great. Mr. Michael Jones, the Tea Party co-founder, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. And we hope we can, meet and have you on the show again very soon.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for what you're doing.